what has happened is a colossal military disaster. We shall go on to the end. We shall never surrender.
Hello, and welcome to Film Rant. I finally get the chance to review a new movie by one of my favourite directors, Christopher Nolan, and this really is a Christopher Nolan film. I mean, it has that gritty, contrasty image, Cillian Murphy and Tom Hardy in a mask. No stupid fucking voices this time though, so it's cool, guys. Now, I'll admit I was disappointed with Nolan's last effort. It was an amazingly made film and was pretty good for 75% of it, but then this shit happened. I mean, what the fuck even is that, Nolan? Come on, lad, you're better than that. I'm a big fan of Nolan because his films have this amazing theme of being very outlandish while grounding things in a somewhat realistic manner. Batman, Inception and most of Interstellar do this spectacularly, but Dunkirk seems to be very far from science fiction and much more of a historical biopic. I was very interested to find out how Nolan handles a very serious movie based on a troublesome time in history. This is also the first Nolan film since Memento that doesn't have his brother Jonathan penning the screenplay. Christopher Nolan is really putting himself up for judgment here by writing and directing, and I can only oblige to judge him as best I can. Be warned though, I'll be going into spoiler territory, so fight your way off the beach and down to the local cinema if you don't want anything spoiled. I usually say that as just a spoiler warning, but seriously, see this movie in a cinema. Even if you don't like the film itself, it's really an exhilarating experience on an IMAX screen. Normally I begin my reviews by talking about the characters, but the fact of the matter is, in Dunkirk, there are none. It's kind of like watching Love Island, there's just no fucking personalities everywhere, and this is worse because there's significantly less tits. Hang on a minute, I got a bit carried away there. I mean, I just said Dunkirk is worse than Love Island. That's absolutely not the case. My bad. But usually a movie having no characters would be a bad thing, right? Absolutely. And while Dunkirk has no singular characters, barring Mark Rylance's character, it does have one character throughout, and that's the British Army. Nobody in this movie is really given any backstory, or even dialogue for that matter. I don't even think we learn the vast majority of people's names. They're just soldier with dark hair, another soldier with dark hair, Harry Styles, an old guy on a boat, and Tom Hardy. That's how you find yourself deciphering who is who. We follow a few soldiers on the beach trying to get off, a couple of officers trying to arrange and oversee evacuations, Tom Hardy and the RAF defending boats out at sea while on their way across the English Channel, and a civilian group on a boat who are crossing the channel to deliver supplies. The only character we really learn about personally is Mark Rylance's character. We learn that he had a son that died in the war, but that's it. We don't see anybody else's ties to home, nobody talks about their family, and nobody talks about their lives. The entire film and the characters themselves are focused on getting off the beach or getting to the beach and helping those stuck there. Some people may really hate this, and I totally get why, but I thought it was great. You don't particularly root for one person because you can't attach yourself to anyone, but you can root for the British Army as a group. I don't know what it's like for people of other nationalities, but as a Brit myself, I thought this was a great decision by Nolan. A question everybody asks concerns a certain teenage heartthrob and bang-average pop star Harry Styles. To be honest, I thought he was fine. He has barely any dialogue and is not focused on that much throughout the movie. His acting was perfectly fine, and to be honest, I wouldn't mind seeing him again. Fair play to the lad. At least his celebrity cameo didn't stick out like a fucking ginger thumb like a certain someone else recently. For fuck's sake, Sheeran, I love you, but why, man? Why? Getting onto the script, Dunkirk is strangely written. Movies often have to follow certain narrative rules such as, well, having a plot. You know, you have characters who do certain things and it moves the story along until you get to a climax and then the movie ends. Christopher Nolan just said, fuck it to plot when he wrote Dunkirk. I mean, there is no real story, it's just a 1 hour 40 account of what happened at Dunkirk from various characters' perspectives. I know war movies are always an account of a battle one way or the other, but they always have a plot. Saving Private Ryan is about a group of soldiers trying to find Matt Damon. Hacksaw Ridge is about the heroics of Desmond Doss and his struggles as a conscientious objector. Black Hawk Down is about rescuing soldiers downed and trapped in a helicopter. Dunkirk has nothing like this, and that may seem like a terrible thing to you, but again, I loved it. I love the honesty of the movie. Nolan is just like, right audiences, I'm not going to give you any characters, I'm not going to give you any real story, but what I am going to give you is the Battle of Dunkirk and how the British people brought their soldiers home. You're not going to get a backstory, you aren't going to get any love stories, and you aren't going to get anybody to tie yourself to. It's like Nolan just wants you to watch this movie and he doesn't care whether you like it or not. He just wanted to make a war film about an important mission during World War II. He doesn't bullshit you with convoluted plots or emotional characters, it's just raw, honest chaos, and I really love that. I totally get it if you'd hate this. I mean, people often want a specific character to root for or some kind of progression in the story, and I'm the same, but I think Dunkirk manages to be brilliant without these things. It's certainly an experimental film with regards to its approach to plot, and it may not be for everyone. One thing I saw a lot of in this movie that I don't see too often in other war films is infighting. Most of the war movies I've seen may have small bits of infighting, but ultimately the message they all put out is that soldiers fought for every last man and nobody was left behind, which is a very noble and respectable message. Dunkirk throws this out the window at some points. We see soldiers almost fighting with each other to get on the boats to escape the beach. We see soldiers get left in the water as their comrades won't allow them onto their rowboat. And we also see Harry Styles basically vote to send a guy to his death to save the rest of the group because he's French. I thought that scene in particular was great for this. The soldiers are coming under fire while trapped below deck in a boat, and they must shed weight to stop the boat from sinking. Harry Styles discovers that one of the guys in there is a French soldier blending in with the British to get off the beach. He refuses that they make him get off the boat, effectively sending him to his death, because he's French, even though the French and British are on the same side. This causes a rift in the group and they argue. I love this kind of moral ambiguity on display. On the one hand, I can see that Harry's character is British and he obviously wants to save his own, but in the conflict of war, your own is also who you're allied with, so he'd still be killing a friend. This is just one example, but I thought that infighting was a prominent feature of this movie and I loved it. Of all the stories in the movie, I thought Tom Hardy's was the best. I mean, I didn't really care for it at first, but then he put on the mask and then I cared. Get it? Now, I really did enjoy Hardy's story from start to finish. He, Cillian Murphy and Jack Lowden form a trio of RAF fighters sent to Dunkirk to provide air support and defend the boats out at sea. They mention in their very first scene that they should keep an eye on their fuel, and you just know that Hardy was going to run out at some point. Their scenes sort of build up a trust and friendship between each pilot, and we see that more after Jack Lowden is downed, and we see him willing Hardy on from the boat he ends up on. Their scenes are pretty average. I mean, you know, it's just plain dogfights over and over, but it's the ending that makes it for me. Hardy runs out of fuel just as he takes out the last German bomber and saves a boat from annihilation. He glides past Dunkirk beach in complete silence, and everyone looks up to him. I really liked how Nolan made that moment completely silent. There's barely any ambient sounds and it's pretty much utter silence. Eventually the music swells and Hardy lands the plane on the beach by manually lowering the landing gear and gliding to safety. I love the symbolism of this. Hardy and his plane, like everyone else involved, quite literally fought until its very last breath. They fought until they had nothing more left to give. They ran out of everything and still managed to pull through. And that's the essence of the movie, really. It's showing the British spirit and how they all banded together to rescue and defend these soldiers. Hardy's story is my favourite just for its wonderful conclusion, and it basically houses the entire message of the film. That's not to say I didn't enjoy the other stories too. The boat story in particular was another one I loved. This probably had the most interesting characters as they actually had dialogue. There was probably the most human elements of the movie in this story too, especially when Cillian Murphy comes on board suffering from PTSD or shell shock. There was a short sequence where Murphy wants Rylance to turn the boat around because he doesn't want to go back, which introduced a lot of tension on the boat. When the kid locked Murphy in the quarters, I could totally understand why, and when things all come to a head, George is accidentally killed. Although they opt not to tell Murphy, which I also thought was another great example of moral ambiguity. I totally understood why they didn't tell him he'd basically committed manslaughter. Also, that George kid, was he a deserter or something? He was definitely in trouble for something, which we see by those guys looking for him in the harbour, forcing him to jump onto the boat and head to Dunkirk. Did we ever find out about that? Let me know in the comments below. Throughout the movie there were 3 scenes in particular which really stood out to me. The first being the scene where Hardy runs out of fuel, which I've already discussed. The other 2 were the first beach scene where the soldiers get dive bombed, and the second was the scene where the soldiers are trapped below deck in a boat, which I've briefly discussed. I just loved how utterly terrifying that beach scene was. As we hear the roaring swell of the dive bombers approaching, the camera cuts to one of the soldiers we've been following, and we see him look around and realise he's on a beach. There is no cover. It was heart-wrenching to have to see all these guys just spread out and lie down on the beach and pray to God they don't get hit by a bomb. There's a shot where our guy is on the left and we see one of his comrades in the background on the right, and the bombs get closer and closer before blowing up the comrade in view and coming to a stop. I thought this was a brilliant introduction to the situation, and Nolan really nailed how much of a shitstorm these guys were in. As for the boat scene, I just loved the tension. The guys keeping quiet when the Dutch dude was walking around the boat, the tension when they suspect the French guy of being a German spy, and the horror of them being fired on with nowhere to go. It was just thrilling to watch. What was with the Dutch guy though? They sort of grab him, he tells them he's Dutch and his army is there to help them. Then we see or hear nothing more of him. Surely you'd think Harry Styles would have thrown his ass out instead of the French guy. I don't really get what the point of his inclusion was. Please enlighten me if you know why he was there. There was a couple of aspects of the movie that I really enjoyed, and these are both script elements and technical elements. I love that we never really got any shots or stories from England. The only time we see England before the very end of the movie is the scene where Mark Rylance and his crew are setting off. It would have been easy for Nolan to show some scenes of Churchill or follow the story of a civilian wanting to help but being trapped in England for now. Instead, Nolan just keeps the views of home out of sight. It's even mentioned by Kenneth Branagh and James Darcy that you can practically see home when you look out at sea, but we never see a shot to demonstrate this. Nolan traps us on the beach with the soldiers. The camera is never where there are no soldiers present, apart from on the civilian boat, and even then Cillian Murphy is there most of the time. I thought that was very clever on Nolan's behalf. It really emphasised that feeling of being trapped. In terms of the script, it's also annoying that we follow the soldiers onto boats only for them to be blown up and washed back ashore again. The audience and soldiers very much move like the tide in a sense, which is very apt for this kind of movie. We're constantly going out to sea and coming back in. Even when the movie cuts between Tom Hardy on the civilian boat and the soldiers on the beach, we are moving into the sea and back to land. I just thought this was interesting from a writing perspective. The other aspect I liked was that we're never really given a concrete view of the enemy. We see a couple of planes in the RAF story and we see a boat near the end, but we never actually fully see a German soldier throughout the movie. The opening shows a group of soldiers running from fire which could be coming from any direction. It really ups the horror factor when you can't see what's hunting you or where the bullets are coming from. It felt like I was playing an armor game where you never have a fucking clue where you're being shot from, and it turns out that you're being shot at by Frank, who's 3 fucking towns away on the other side of the map and you can barely fucking see him. Oh, that game pisses me off. Anyway, this is Film Rant and not Game Rant, so yeah, I love that Nolan kept the enemy out of view. I always find it frustrating in modern horror movies where they show the monster or psycho murderer early on. It makes it much less scary in my opinion. This is a war movie, but it still has the horror element of being shot at by an unknown force. I've always wanted them to do that with Batman actually. Make him an unseen, unforgiving force. But that's another video for another time. As for the technical aspects of the movie, the one that'll stick out the most to people is the non-linear editing. Now this is not the first time Nolan's dipped his dick into the hole of non-linear editing, as we saw with his masterpiece Memento. However, in Memento it served a purpose. The disjointed timeline added a sense of mystery to the film and you had to kind of work out what went where and where it was all going. The non-linear narrative points of Dunkirk are both barely present and not needed at all. If you're going to do non-linear editing, then you have to go 2 cocks to the cunt with it, or it just doesn't really make any sense why it's there. It's too infrequent in Dunkirk, and as a result I fail to see its purpose whatsoever. I like to think Nolan is above using it as a cheap excuse for artistry. I'm sure there's a reason he did it, but I have absolutely no idea why it's there. It added nothing and it just felt odd. I really like that Nolan was able to evoke a sense of terror and realism without relying on gore. Lots of modern war movies like to show decapitated soldiers and people being disemboweled and shit like that, and most people can take it as desensitization is probably through the roof at the moment. Hacksaw Ridge was one of the most brutal war movies I've seen, and I praised it for its gore as it used gore well in the context of the movie. Nolan manages to evoke the same amount of horror and chaos without reverting to gore, which I think has to be commended. If you're squeamish, you can totally watch Dunkirk with no problems, but don't assume you won't be horrified. As is typical for a Nolan film, the cinematography in this movie is like looking into Zac Efron's eyes. You just get lost in its beauty. Surprisingly, Nolan didn't use his usual boy Wally Pfister to take on the role of cinematographer, but instead used his previous cinematographer from Interstellar, Hoyt van Hoytema. I think their work is very similar though, and I love both of their work on Nolan's movies. The way the shots are lit, the composition and the colour grading are always top notch on Nolan's films. Even if you don't enjoy the plot, you can always enjoy the visual spectacle, and this works fantastically in Dunkirk as it doesn't really have a plot. It's all about the experience. That said, there is some very strange lighting differences and time changes during edits. Sometimes it's dark, then it cuts and it's light again, then it's sunset, then it's daytime again. It could be down to the non-linear editing, but it never comes across as that. It just comes across as poor and confusing. There's a scene near the end where James Darcy gets on a boat and Kenneth Branagh opts to stay back. As Darcy gets on the boat, it's quite bright daylight. It looks like mid-afternoon. Then when we cut immediately to the next shot, which shows Darcy looking back at Branagh on the pier as he pulls away, the lighting looks very dark, as if the day is just barely getting its last few seconds of light. It was such a jarring cut in terms of lighting, and it looked a little amateur, which is very surprising in a Chris Nolan film. There was also an edit at some point early in the movie where we see two characters in a two-shot and then it cuts to a close-up of one of them from exactly the same angle. Kind of like this. This kind of cut is a big no-no in my book. Again, it just looks amateur. It's weird that the movie has these easily fixable and unprofessional moments because the rest of the movie is absolutely stellar in terms of production quality. Finally, I want to talk about the sound design. This really stood out to me. The roar of the swooping dive bombers, the smashing of planes into water, the ripping blast of a gunshot, it's all loud and terrifying without being obnoxious. Nolan really nailed the sound. Some movies just turn the volume up loud and it gets annoying, but Nolan just manages to find the right balance to make them loud enough to scare you, but not loud enough to make you cover your ears like you're at a Coldplay concert. I also love the modified version of Nimrod by Sir Edward Elgar that played as Tom Hardy flew silently over the beach. This classical piece of music is often associated with Britain, and I thought the slower version really evoked the right emotion as we watched Hardy touch down a hero. It's a great composition and utilised perfectly. So overall, Dunkirk as a movie is extremely strange in that it has no real characters and no plot, but you do find yourself rooting for the British Army and civilians as a whole. It's a movie specifically designed to be experienced in cinemas. It's visceral, frightening, and inspirational. The whole movie is basically just Nolan saying, "Hey guys, look what I can do," and I think he really pulls it off. He doesn't focus on plots or subplots or fleshing out his characters, but just brings you a harrowing and chaotic depiction of an important part of World War II. The movie has some wonderful moments and there are parts of the script that are very interesting, and from a technical standpoint it's pretty much perfect save for the few strange amateur mistakes. The non-linear editing is utterly pointless, but I feel it can be overlooked in lieu of the vast amount of quality found elsewhere. Dunkirk is one of the best war movies I've ever seen and one of the best movies Nolan has ever done. It certainly beats Interstellar. Falling into a black hole and ending up behind your own fucking bookshelf. Jesus wept. Dunkirk gets 4.5 frames out of 5. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Film Rant.
You can practically see it from here.
What?
Home.